Uh, all right, we're recording. This is about reimagining and re-inhabiting cities for what's called the Anthropocene. I don't know if anyone's familiar with the term Anthropocene. I'll explain a little bit more later. And then specifically how the urban ecology center's approach to neighborhood, community, environmental development is fostering this sort of reimagining, re-inhabiting of urban spaces and how we interact with them. I don't know if y'all do this typically, but I kind of would briefly just, I guess, like to know what's if people are engaging here. I don't. Everyone's got their screens off, but like if anyone would be willing to share, like what's been your involvement or connection with the Urban Ecology Center. Um, hey, we could probably have time for like a few people if they want to jump in and share anything, or if not, I'll just keep moving. All right, I'm gonna keep moving then. So yeah, my name is Mike Zang. I studied anthropology and philosophy. First got involved with the Urban Ecology Center in 2011. I worked at Washington Park and I was an AmeriCorps volunteer. So that was kind of my gateway into this world and into land stewardship and even urban planning, which I study now as a PhD student. I worked for a few different conservation associations, the Nature Conservancy, and then Tall Timbers. So I do have a background in land management and habitat restoration, conservation. I went back to school in 2018 for urban planning, focusing on environmental planning, graduated at the height of COVID, and then kind of let myself get roped into doing a PhD at Florida State University, which I'm about three-fourths of the way through, and most of this is what my research is all about. So I'd like to start off. This is a really inspiring quote that um, kind of prompts and pushes my work. It's by David Harvey, who is a critical geographer and economist. And he says, actually, I got to put this in presentation mode. Sorry. The question of what kind of city we want cannot be divorced from the question of what kind of people we want to be, what kinds of social relations we seek, what relations to nature we cherish, what style of life we desire, what aesthetic values we hold. So from the start, right, basically what I'm asking myself is, as I go into this project, is how do we adapt cities, neighborhoods, communities to the current challenges of our world? And not just, I'm not looking at this from a large top-down kind of scale. I'm looking at it more so from a background in community development, small scale sustainability. So how do we do this from within, from the bottom up, as more of like a place-based collaborative effort? That's the question I was originally asking myself through school. My education experience points me towards, well, change can come certainly from, some external force, some program, some, funding mechanism, some innovative design feature, but really like having a background in anthropology and philosophy, I think, well, change has to come from us changing as a society, as a culture, more on a philosophical level. So, and then how those kind of like mental, psychological, cultural changes can shift into to have an application in the real world. And so, having worked for the Urban Ecology Center, I thought, they're doing a lot of the very work that I'm thinking of as I study urban planning as a master's student. And so that's what inspired me to come back to Milwaukee and conduct this sort of research and sort of peel back all the different layers of work that's going on and asking myself, so then how does the how does the Urban Ecology Center make this sort of change as a whole, as an organization? What are the impacts on individuals? And then those individuals have impacts upon other people and communities. What is the UEC's, how do they impact change at a community level, whether that's through programs or events and activities. And then the highest scale of this is like, how are they influencing planning and politics, which I'm not really going to get to today. In fact, I'm probably going to have to cut off a lot of this because I just have too much information and yeah, I don't want to. So anyway, kind of research goals and the goals even of this presentation too, right? I imagine this is a bit different from the types of presentations you typically get with this, but so some of my goals are to like obviously highlight the work that's going on at the Urban Ecology Center and why it's important. But for people who are familiar with the UEC, altering and expanding perceptions of the type of work that's going on, putting it in an urban and a neighborhood planning context. So, it surprises me a lot when like I meet people who say are volunteering for like land stewardship, and I would share with them some of the other aspects of work that's happening. And often I would come to find that people had no idea that, the UEC was involved with like the Greenways master plan or, putting in a playground or, other, beyond land stewardship and education. Um, Reorienting sustainability goals towards more community based and place based grassroots movements. As I said before, kind of thinking of this as a way to reimagine cities at the neighborhood scale and how we're like changing cultures at a smaller scale. And then highlighting why it's important that the Urban Ecology Center takes I'm going to use this word a lot, so it's a mouthful though, but socio-ecological paradigm. So that integration of social and ecological, and why that's so important for the future of urbanism and of cities. And then lastly, too, if anyone's not familiar with like anthropology or ethnographies, introducing you to this as a research method, as a type of soft science. Um, that's been my research methodology. So give you a little bit of insight into that. Um, Rather than asking these questions of you, I guess I'll just kind of give you my insights. So a lot of the conversation about sustainability, right? This is from academia. This is from private companies. This is from just, I guess, general mainstream culture. Like we have these images of very techno-oriented futures, right? This is kind of like the upper echelon of what you might imagine like an ecological city might look like in the future. Some of these are actually not the future, but they are the present. Um, and I don't doubt that we're going to need cities like this. I don't doubt that we will have cities like this or aspects of cities that are like this. However, I do think that it's important to shift the conversation in a big way towards smaller scale, less technologically oriented, less consumer engineering oriented solutions, and shift it more towards the cultural side of things of like what are we doing as a people, as a community to be engaged, right? Because I think underlying this approach, and I'll go to the next slide, right? We think that we can sort of outsource the solutions in some way, like, oh, once we have electric vehicles, or once everything is automated, and once all of our homes are smart and hooked up to to this like artificial intelligence, that we can just sort of let what we innovate solve the problems that we have right now. And I think maybe they will play a role. But we cannot discount the role that like we need to play as living human beings to um, participate within this. I think it's almost dangerous in a way to put too much reliance and too much faith in a technological solution, but rather um, reorienting our mindsets towards grassroots, small scale sustainability that's just happening right in our neighborhoods. And if I think you do that bit by bit and you build that community, that's at least part of my vision of the future of urbanism. And it's not just mine, right? So a lot of the literature that I draw upon focuses exactly upon this. So from different disciplines as well. So Bennett, this is quoting from the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment, which is a huge document, talks about a sustainable future hinges first upon building strong community-based stewardship. Sampson, the next quote, he's an eco-psychologist, talks about the requirements of re-envisioning the human-nature relationship. The next two are a couple ecological designers defining and conceptualizing new approaches to urbanism, new sensibilities that harmonize tensions between ecological and urbanism. Lister, this is a really interesting concept here, talks about sin ecologies, which is an integrated cultural and natural ecology. And that's like, help again, this is this reimagining of like, well, humans are not separate from nature, our neighborhoods are not separate from this. And then how do we sort of recognize that and use that as an empowering concept to move forward and help develop cities differently. And then Sandercock, Leonie Sandercock, who's a planner and professor, talks about a new planning imagination that shifts us away from rational modes of traditional Western planning practice. So this whole concept that we can control everything, we can put nature in a box, and we can sort of build or engineer our way out of these problems. So these are some of the literature that I draw from that inspires my work and my insights into this. I'm going to skip through this and just bop on over right to my research design and methods. So, is anyone familiar with ethnographies or studied anthropology or interested in culture? Okay. Is that am I are y'all hearing me? Because I feel like I'm talking.
Yeah, yep,
Okay,
you're
okay. I just
okay.
want to check, right? I just want to make sure that I'm not just talking to the screen here. Okay, I've got y'all. Okay. Um, so here, let me just jump right in then. So ethnographic research, it was popularized by anthropology, which I guess is a growth of sociology, but it literally means writing culture. So I'm using myself as a research instrument, using my own awareness and experience to to go about recording whatever is happening in the field. And the field, in this case, being all my interactions with and around and through the Urban Ecology Center, but also the larger context in which the Urban Ecology Center is operating. So really, it kind of becomes this holistic picture of everyday experiences through my lens, using my memories, my interpretation, in my interviews, my observations, the whole material world and everything around, right? So I did not confine myself to just programs at the UEC, but like even if just living in River West and having conversations that were related or semi-related, or um, bike commuting to the other branches and sort of just being in those neighborhoods. So it's very expansive. To me, it's very interesting, but also can be unwieldy. But what's at the core of this is asking the question again: is how or to what extent do these programs, activities, events, how does the presence of the Urban Ecology Center and its broader influence transform our sensibilities, our knowledge, and and then this word here, imaginaries, which I use a lot, um, is important because it's kind of how do we how are we as a community or as a society, as a culture, thinking about what's possible for the future, right? So it's not just what we think right now is acceptable. We say like, oh yeah, we do that. This is something that we do in our neighborhoods, or but rather also like what are we imagining as a culture for the future. Um, so what I did, mine was more of a focused ethnography. Typically, ethnographies are like a year or longer, and I did not spend that much time. So I was here for 5 months last summer, from May to October. I lived, if any of you know Ken, I lived with Ken Leinbach at the Hawk's Nest in River West. So I was pretty close to Riverside Park, and that was another advantage for me, just to kind of be in the community, be situated within what's happening in the vicinity. And as I said, I bike everywhere, so even that was sort of part of my data, my observations of like what's going on in the rest of the city as I bike from River West to Washington Park, or as I bike from River West to Menominee Valley, and all the places in between, and sort of noting differences, intuiting differences. Like there's obviously segregation. There's all these kind of factors that create the broader context within which this work is taking place, and that's all really important. But at the core of it, it's participant observation. So me being involved directly with programs like land stewardship, like civic science, community science, um, attending events, activities, you know, that are just going on at the UEC, or from, any of their partners, any other neighborhood organizations associated with. I conducted 36 interviews with staff, volunteers, residents, partners. And then the content analysis part was just like, if I came across organizational documents, reports, brochures, websites, plans, social media, I'm kind of just trying to take as much in as I could. And this is all, right, technically data for a qualitative scientist. I'm going to skip this just for the sake of time, but there's lots of limitations to this work. It's nebulous, so it's unclear often what is important. If I'm the research instrument, then I'm coming in it with my own preconceptions, assumptions, my own narratives, my biases. So trying to make those as transparent as possible. Um, there's no way to prove really any of this stuff like in a causal frame. Like there's a few instances where I have people saying like, yes, this is exactly what inspired me to change my behaviors, or yes, it was this event exactly that you know turned into this huge neighborhood shift or whatever. But for the most part, there's no proving any of this. It's just kind of correlation, right? I'm just kind of like constructing this story, and I'm just piecing these things together in a way that makes sense to me. So more of my data came from Riverside Park, but having worked at Washington Park in the past, I drew upon a lot of memories and what I remember. I mean, I definitely spent time at all three branches, but um, that was another limitation. I think a lot of the people that I interviewed, the informants that I had, are more of the exceptions rather than the norms. So that might, my data is kind of skewed in that way. And there's just a lot of data. So it's that's a strength and a weakness, because then it's up to me to kind of winnow through all this stuff and figure what's the real story here? What's, and how do I sort of take these disparate phrases and sayings and interviews and observations, and throw this all together into something that makes sense, that tells a story about reimagining cities. The whole sequence of these things is screwed up. But all right, so here's the data analysis. So this is kind of really the substance of this. And I did have plans for this presentation to pause at moments and sort of elicit some ideas from the audience. It doesn't seem like we're feeling too interactive today. So, but please feel free. Like if you have, if something that I highlight here registers with you, um, I do want to take some time to hear like your story, your side of things, to say like, yeah, actually, 10 years ago, I remember going to this program and then this kind of triggered some spark in me, whatever. So this is my data analysis. So obviously, right, I think anyone who's familiar with the work going on here, hey, yep, thanks, Kim, gotcha. This is kind of the basis of the work from my point of view is the green space protection, restoration, and management. This kind of without the green spaces, I don't think you'd have anything else that follows. So um, I'm not going to spend too much time reiterating these stories. I imagine that a lot of people are familiar with what has gone on in the past here, but right. So things start out at Riverside Park. You got the whole history of Elsa Uncle and the way that she organized. This is pre-UEC, nonprofit status, but this is kind of the very core of what has gone on, and in a big way is still the core of what's going on. Just getting people involved to start cleaning up the park, just getting more of a presence in the park because the park was not a safe place back in the late 80s, early 90s. Um, so it's interesting because some of these theories are also very much used in urban theory. Is that right? If anyone's read Jane Jacobs, she talks about the eyes on the street. And so that's just like if you just make places decent that people want to go to, you get more people inhabiting those spaces and it becomes safer. And that's what happened at Riverside Park. Similarly, there's this broken window theory where it's like if you walk through a neighborhood and everything's trashed and all the homes have broken windows and you're looking, it's more likely that people are going to continue to desecrate that place. Whereas if you bring in a bunch of volunteer land stewards from the neighborhood and you start to clean things up and you clean litter and you start pulling invasives and planting trees, people start to reconceptualize that space and you say, oh, this is not a place to trash, but rather this is a place to cherish, and um, we should take care of it ourselves, right? So that's essentially what happened. And right, so you could talk to people who've been around for a while, like Dennis, who's a board member. I talked to Ann Steinberg, who's been around for a long time. Um, so that's the very basis, right? Green space protection, kind of cleaning things up. But what this does is that it entices greater park use and enjoyment, and then people start to form attachments with these places. So to use an example from one of my interviews, right? Ann Steinberg, she moved here in, I want to say like the early 90s from LA. And she talks about going on these, backpacking trips, going camping out west. And that was wilderness to her. When she moved to Milwaukee and she lives nearby, she has lived nearby Riverside Park for decades, is that she started finding herself spending a lot more time upon these trails that were being cleaned up. She's hiking along the river, she's spending more time there. She's starting to form this relationship with the woods that are there, with the river. Um, and this is helping her see see the city differently, right? Nature could exist in the city. And not only that, but you can form a relationship with nature in the city. It doesn't have to be some far away wilderness where you're cut off from civilization, but rather this could be right in your own backyard. So this was like a catalytic moment. And I think this illustrates kind of the chain reactions that take place here is that, right? So in Anne's case, right, she develops this relationship. She winds up getting involved with the Urban Ecology Center. She winds up on the board. Um, she winds up being a key player in some neighborhood initiatives like Friends of Real Food, um, putting on potlucks each month, organizing like the CSA open house. More recently, she's working with Milwaukee Riverkeeper to do the sturgeon protectors program. which the UEC is sort of helping as a base, and that she walks along the rivers. I just saw her the other day. I was out attending a program on Saturday, and I saw Anne walking around, and she's educating people about sturgeons coming back. So, you know, without that initial like green space protection and the care that's being conducted in the parks and along the river, you don't have people forming these relationships. You wouldn't have someone like Anne who's then becoming an actor in her neighborhood to like continually promote more of this of similar work and of different work as well. So people start interacting with these places differently. Another good example is like as the river's being cleaned up and as the greenway is being restored, you have more people coming to fish. I spoke with I also worked with river revitalization as well as part of this, and there was one of the volunteers we had who was also retired from MMSD. He's been living along the river since the 90s and talks about, the quote I have here is like, the alleys and garbage cans backed up to the water, seeping pollutants. Nobody really even thought about the river. So going from that state of this river where it wasn't even really a thought in people's minds, it was just kind of like a you know a refuse site, to now like 2024, and if you go down there, there's fly fishers coming in from Iowa, from Minnesota. It's been a complete transformation, not just of the river, but of how we in Milwaukee perceive the river, and then it's drawing in people from all other states who are interested in fishing in this case, but for other reasons as well. So this is that shifting of perception that I'm talking about, and it's kind of the very basis, I think, is that you're forming a place attachment. You're helping to first create a sense of place in the people who live around these green spaces, right? So that's kind of the basis of this. And I should have said this earlier, but each one of these kind of key concepts or slides sort of builds upon the next, right? So it's kind of this whole, um, I guess it's some sort of theory that I'm putting together, but this type of work and the way that there's different components of this, different dimensions that um, the way this works out. So another story, right? These are shots from Menominee Valley. This is like before the center was created, before the park was created. Derelict site, unused. Um, people people did not come here. The building was abandoned. You could see there was just no access. And this is really interesting to me on a psychological, on a cultural level. So I spoke with, well, this is what it looks like now after the little spur was put in, the Valley Passage. Now you have, yeah, yeah, it really is an amazing transformation. And now you could look at it and just say, oh wow, that's a really crazy project. Wow, what an amazing project. The thing to me that's most interesting, um, and I got this from interviewing Corey Zetz, who's on the Menominee Valley Partners, is she's here. I'll just read from the quote, right? From the neighborhood residents that we heard from, because they were conducting all these community meetings. Many of the residents felt surprised that there was actually a river there because there had never been access. There was no way to get back there. So the overall, the biggest thing is how it changed people's perceptions, right? You're living, a few hundred feet, a quarter mile, a half mile from a river that you don't even know is there. You can't build, right? Or your sense of place is totally different, I think, in if you know there's a river there, or if you can go down to the river to, you're like, you don't have an experience like Ann Steinberg had if you can't even get to the river, if you don't even know the river's there. So this work, right, it transformed the landscape itself, and you could talk about the ecosystem services that it affords, and now the recreation that goes on down there. But really at the base of this is like it's just even tuning people in, like at as a neighborhood, as a community, to the fact that there is even a river here, because without that, then none of the rest of the work really takes place. So, and I had a conversation. There's kind of a similar story if you look into the LA River and what's going on there. The guy who started the Friends of the LA River, he and this is a huge project going on there, but he said the first thing we had to do was even convince to get people on board to restore the river. He's saying we had to convince people that there even was a river there. So, and I think that's an important step, right? It's transforming people's perceptions of their neighborhoods that, oh yeah, there is a river now. Now that there's access, you can go down there and you can fish and you can kayak, or you could just sit there and just, watch ducks on the river. That creates this positive feedback loop, kind of like with the fly fishermen eventually coming in and now using the Milwaukee River, but changing perceptions, those changed perceptions can evolve into actions or routine. So people who walk along the river all the time, who start spending more time, maybe getting involved in recreation, maybe more hands-on stuff, which I'll touch in a bit. So this is a really interesting phenomenon for me as studying urban planning. Is right. This goes back to that like sort of cultural work that needs to take place within the sustainability framework, is just first really connecting people, changing their perceptions. 11th birthday at Three Bridges Park. That's awesome. And you can hear this even from younger folks. So there was a land steward last summer who I worked with at Washington Park, and so this was at Washington Park. We were cutting cattails one day, and he said that he grew up just maybe a mile or two north of Washington Park in Sherman Park neighborhood, and he had passed by. He was probably 18 or 19 and had spent his whole life kind of just passing by the park, but it wasn't until working as a land steward that it really kind of changed his whole conceptualization of Washington Park, that like, oh wait, there's some wild spaces here. Like this is a place I can come to and go for a hike and sort of get away from the city in some way. And he took a lot of pride in that. And he took a lot of pride in being part of it too. That he said something to the effect of like imagining 20 years from now when he looks at this park and remembering that like he played a role in doing that. So that's, again, this is kind of another example of building this place attachment where people feel an emotional connection to these places that builds that like grassroots connection that starts that human nature relationship that I mentioned earlier. It's the basis for that, in which grassroots sustainability needs to be built upon. Um, let's see here. I'm going to move on for the sake of time. Does anybody want to add anything? I'm going to try to wrap up at like 9:50, so we could sort of do like a closing, whatever, people can ask questions and stuff. So more hands-on stuff. This is place-based education, and then praxis is just a fancy word for a combined practice and thought. It's like we're not just educating people in an abstract way, but we're also giving them practical, hands-on, experiential, like applied type of learning at the same time. Um, so right, Kim's in the chat. Kim was the former director of land management, and so this is stewardship. This is civic science. This is conducting water quality surveys. This is getting people hands on. It's not just a matter of like we're just casually walking through these places as consumers, so to speak, but we're actually engaged. We have a you know, we're learning skills at the same time. Um, and so this is creating more of this like rootedness, this situatedness within nature in the city, that we're not just spectators, but rather starting to realize that like, oh, we actually, as humans, we're playing a role in these spaces. And I pull from a few. It's really interesting when you go back and read some literature from the late 1800s, from the early 1900s. Like if anyone's familiar with John Dewey, he's kind of talking about this like over 100 years ago. He's he's a pragmatic philosopher, maybe the one of the most famous American philosophers we have, but he's talking about education needs to be based where you are. It right. It's great to know sort of these like higher concepts, but like if we're not basing our education upon the places that we live in the context that we interact with every single day, which includes nature, which includes the environment that we live in, which includes culture, um then we're sort of just educating this like people who are just placeless, who are just transient, and don't really have any sort of rootedness or sense of obligation to those places. And that's, I think, where we're at really. The university academics are just like bouncing around all the time. And Felicia, who was an intern last year as well, she points this out, right? And kind of reflecting on her experience as a land steward, but also as a recent graduate of the university, saying that you don't learn anything about this stuff at any point throughout school. Talking about like plant knowledge, local ecosystem knowledge. Um, I was never really interested in science, but she moved to Milwaukee. She started working here. She spends more time on the trails now than she did growing up out in the country. Everything in Milwaukee is more walkable than in rural Wisconsin. I've honestly been outside more now that I moved to the city. But her reflections were a lot about her education, and that she did not get this type of education that was place based. It didn't allow her to really build um, like an awareness of the environment and a sense of place. So, um, right, on an individual level, this type of work, the internships, and specifically helping to cultivate this place based sensibility. Um, there's another, she was a volunteer, Emily, and I really appreciated interviewing her because she was perhaps the epitome, I think, of what the UEC maybe is trying to cultivate, in that she moved here from London, I think. She lives right by Riverside Park. She comes to the volunteer stewardship sessions weekly, pretty much. And she has this kind of whole, like, I would call it like a bioregional identity. Is like her identity is like so connected to the time that she spends walking the trails. She has a community garden down along the Oak Leaf Trail. Like I said, she volunteers, so she's hands-on as well. It's not just that she just walks through the park and is just taking this in passively, but she's actively engaged in this too. And so this quote here, she's talking about um, sense of place and place attachment, getting to know a place, not only the streets where you recognize buildings and landmarks, but also parks, and recognizing those natural landmarks as well. I'd say volunteering there at the UBC has really been a gateway for everything I've learned about what habitats and environments belong where in this country, or at least around the Great Lakes. So again, I said this earlier. I think that a lot of my informants were perhaps the exceptions and not the norms. But if we're talking in sort of theoretical terms, it's like I think these are the types of um, ideas and personas, for lack of a better word, that we're hoping to cultivate within this framework of grassroots sustainabilities. People who feel connected to their places, who spend a lot of time in these places, as if it, It's just an extension of the neighborhood, and it creates these habits within us. Um, to go back again to some older literature, I'm looking at the left column here where basis for bioregionalism. If anyone's familiar with like Lewis Mumford, he was a early urban planner, regional planner. Benton McKay, he was the guy who it was his idea to start the Appalachian Trail. These people had theories in the early 1900s about this sort of work, and it never came to fruition for various reasons. Um, I guess the Depression and World Wars being partly the case, but creating a bioregionalism and um, having specific education curriculum programs, social infrastructure that supports um, this type of learning and this local ethos that I think the Urban Ecology Center is cultivating amongst its staff, amongst its volunteers, in kind of in a broader way, just among the neighborhoods in general. So I see it as 9:45 now, so I'm gonna skip ahead a little. No, actually, I could probably just finish here and then call it good. And yeah. So what you find when you start to interact with these, these types of programs, which so I spent a lot of time like working as a volunteer myself, forming relationships with volunteers, interviewing volunteers, just being a part of this type of work, is that there's a lot more going on than just um, the stewardship itself or helping people learn about ecology and plants. It's inspiring people to then take those practical experiences and apply them elsewhere, whether that's in their own gardens or, and so Theater Dave, he talks about the way that his involvement with the Urban Ecology Center helped him realize the dire state of the world that we're in, and giving him practical skills that he can learn how to propagate plants and garden. Um, some people, right, and I learned this just from asking questions and from interviewing, then can take that knowledge and transfer it to other parts of the city or other parts of their lives. So Mike Garvey, who is a stalwart volunteer, he's been volunteering for like 15 years or so, um, tells me in conversation one time when we were out like digging up daylilies or something about the way that he is involved with his neighborhood association and got there was a bunch of master gardeners who wanted to put in some ornamentals, and he was very vocal about putting in pollinator gardens with natives. So using the knowledge that he's procured from his time volunteering to then influence a different system somewhere else throughout the city. So, um, proposing that we don't put ornamentals. We want to support pollinators, and whoever the head of the neighborhood association was accepted, and he said, "All right, we'll put you in charge of this, and you can go ahead and help create this rain garden." So there's a lot of conversational learning going on, a lot of social learning within these volunteer groups, but then there's spillover into the neighborhoods. So there's no way to prove that River West looks the way it does because of the Urban Ecology Center. But if you talk to enough people who've been here for a long enough time, they'll tell you about like the changes that they've seen for better and for worse. Um, Inspiring, right? It to me as an ethnographer, it's obvious that, and remember, I bike everywhere, so I'm biking out west, I'm biking north. You start to get a couple of miles away from these epicenters, and it's different at Washington Park and it's different at Menominee Valley. There's a lot of intervening factors here, but right, if you go out to West Dallas, the landscapes in the neighborhood don't look quite like this. Um, this is the type of like reimagining urbanism that um, I think we need. And I think that, right, the UEC might not be directly responsible for, but they are helping plant seeds in people's minds. Like Theater Dave, who I mentioned before, who through his involvement with the Urban Ecology Center has really started to adopt certain practices that I would say are, extremely localized, like resilient, sustainability based. And now this is the last thing, and I'll wrap it up here so I could like harvest some questions or get some comments here. But um, I used the term spillover before, talking about how maybe these ideas or these practices sort of over time through some sort of cultural osmosis kind of start to move outwards and change neighborhoods, change what people are doing in neighborhoods or what people think they could do in neighborhoods. This sort of systems change can I see happening also across time and across other, you know, across longer periods of time and in different ways too. So the way that this work might inspire young people, and some of you might know Darren Madison, he was about 13 years old when I worked with him over at Washington Park. And I interviewed him now. He's a state assemblyman. And this is one of those examples where I could say, like, there is causality here. His own quotes are that the time that he spent growing up at the Urban Ecology Center made him more aware of not just environmental issues and sustainability, but also gave him this like sense of justice that's connected to it as well, through programs and through the responsibilities he was given. He eventually wound up interning and working with the UEC. He goes on to help develop the Office of Sustainability's Eco Neighborhood Program right now, or at least a year ago. He told me that he's promoting a Green Careers program throughout Wisconsin altogether, which is modeled off of the Urban Ecology Center's Green Careers Pathways program that they have. And he, I think maybe not what's more important, but behind all this, he just has this kind of this vision that cities can look different, that we don't have to live in the current form, the current conventions of urbanism that we live in, but rather we can sort of take some of the work that's going on in the parks and hopefully promote it throughout the neighborhoods as well, promoting a rewilding of the neighborhoods, small scale sustainability practices throughout neighborhoods in Milwaukee. And as an elected official, right, he actually has like, I mean, we all have power to do things in our neighborhoods, but as an elected official who's been inspired by this type of work and by these types of thoughts, that's pretty powerful. And that's just another way of altering systems throughout cities, right? It's kind of a crapshoot. You kind of don't know like who's going to grow up and become a state assemblyman, but um, that's the impacts long term. Darren's obviously an exception. He's an outstanding young man and all that, but I'm sure if I spent 5 years doing this type of work, I'm sure I could find a whole bunch of other examples like Darren. And this is the way that I'm just sort of following the stories and tracing this and trying to bring it to light. And a lot of this probably already known by folks who are involved with this sort of work, but um, not so much in, I think, urban planning circles. There's not quite as much conversation going on like this. So I'm gonna wrap it up right there. I could probably do like a 3-part series on this. It's just I have a lot of data. Thanks for letting me do this. This has been, and I'll take questions in a second, but I just want to say lastly, this has been kind of my first attempt to really like any to put together any sort of semi-comprehensive overview of everything that I've done up to this point. So the last couple of weeks working on this has really been critical for me to like, if I have a presentation to do, I'm like, oh, I gotta try and like make this make sense somehow. So this has been a great practice for me in putting together my thoughts and kind of streamlining things. And it's still an unwieldy mess, I think, but hopefully some of these stories and anecdotes were insightful and perhaps make you think differently about the work that the UEC is doing and kind of inspires you yourself to maybe think differently about what you do and the way you inhabit space in cities. So, yeah, that's it. Any questions? Any comments?